Hello, everybody. Many thanks for coming, as ever, to the latest in the new season of our seminars on social analysis, penality across boundaries. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Mark Brown from the University of Sheffield today. Mark and I have known each other since we were very much younger at this academic life. Mark's got a long track record of really, interesting and important work on history and sociology of punishment in many contexts, both in Australia, so in a Western, if not Northern setting, and latterly and increasingly in South Asia in particular. So he's the author of Penal Power and Colonial Rule, and one of the authors of The New Punitiveness, and many, many other works. And today's paper, which is on Penalities, the Global South, an Indian case study, is a joint production with Vijay Raghavan of the Tata Institute in Mumbai, but unfortunately Vijay can't join us today. So Mark is going to present their joint work solo. So without further ado, our usual approach, as I'm sure you know, Mark, is we ask you to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have about half an hour of discussion. And let's go. Thank you.
Yep, that sounds good, Richard. Thank you. And let me just see if I can get my slides up on the screen here. So, as Richard noted, this was due to be a joint presentation with Vijay from Tata Institute in Mumbai, but he's been called away by an urgent family matter. But this is very much a piece of work which has rested on teamwork, which I'll show you a little more of in a moment, even if it's just me here presenting today. You can see in this title slide, members of the community under the Amar Mahal flyover. So this is in fact a photograph, part of a series of photographs of denotified tribal communities in Maharashtra in India. And the status of this community is that they are in fact living under this flyover. And they are one of the communities that we have explored in the research, which I'll speak about today. So this research and what I'm going to speak about today is drawn from some work I've been doing in South Asia since about 1999, and which has traced the colonial penal history and now contemporary post-colonial history of the treatment of certain marginalized communities in India. And so the paper that we published just towards the end of last year was a joint paper between myself, Vikas Jadhav, who's at JNU University in Delhi, Vijay, who was due to join us but can't today, and Mayank Sinha, who is part of the, I suppose, action research team at the Tata Institute. So what I'd like to do today is just spend a bit of time talking about the context of this research very briefly, then talking about colonial penal power, which is not so much an effort to reprise a whole lot of earlier work that I've done as to set the context for understanding the legacies that we find in today's environment in India of certain configurations of penal power in the colonial era. I then want to speak a little bit about how at the moment of independence and the initial post-colonial moment, many of these arrangements were reconfigured, but perhaps in rather surprising ways. And so we will then trace the history of these communities from the 19th century through to the 21st. And then I want to finish by asking some questions, making some suggestions about what's novel about the forms of penality in the South, at least to the extent that we can gather from this, this case study. So this, the context for this research is that it connects, I suppose, 3 periods in time. So historical research that I have done from the 19th and early 20th centuries, some work I've done on the post-colonial moment, and now this research team coming together to look at 2 communities and how 70 years after independence, they find themselves in the wake of independence, the decolonial moment, and so on. And so here we have another photograph of this Padi community. And we also looked at a community who are called the Kiria Sabas, who are rural nomads in West Bengal, but I'm not going to have time to include them in the presentation today. But it's important to recognise the deep engagement and field work that was done by Vikas and Mayank with those communities in which they were embedded for a very long time as ethnographic criminological researchers. So just to give those of you who are not familiar with South Asia and the colonial history of South Asia some kind of incredibly brief potted history, which will, is inadequate in many ways, but it does set something of a scene. So the question of, well, how long were the British in South Asia, in India? Well, the British East India Company, which was a joint stock trading company, one of the first created in the City of London, was given a monopoly for commerce and a royal warrant to operate in India by the Crown in I think 1660 was when the warrant was issued, and their monopoly status dates right back to 1600. So they began a series of settlements around mainly the coastline, and in this image here we have Fort St. George in what was then Madras and is modern-day Chennai. And from these commercial outposts, the East India Company ruled from around the 1640s to 1858, after which there was the insurrection, variously termed and labelled, and then the British state took over and governed until 1947. But the important thing is this, that the East India Company, as a commercial enterprise, established government, established a whole series of courts, a justice system, raised a military, issued its own currency, and in many ways acted like a state. And the model of governance, which was established at that time, became important across the empire. And so one of the reasons for studying India was it was very much regarded as a kind of a paradigmatic example of how to govern govern a people, as they were referred. And so certain things like the Indian Penal Code, which is in fact still in operation in India today, and in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh, variations of it in Malaysia, in Singapore, it was exported to Sudan, to Kenya, what is now Kenya, to Nigeria, and so on. And approaches to customary law and so on. So this is the background of colonial power, and within that, I suppose there's a kind of a subset of activity in the penal sphere. If we're going to think about legacies, it's important to understand that the colonial that colonial penal power was not all-encompassing, and in many ways it was marked as much by what it left alone as by what it attempted to control. And so if anyone is interested in reading some important work in this area, a good place to start is an essay called Chandra's Death by Renajit Dua, who was part of the Subaltern Studies Collective, and this is from the late 1980s. And the case of Chandra is something which he has retrieved, I suppose, from a variety of sources outside the mainstream archive. But this young woman, Chandra, died as a result of a botched attempt at medicinal abortion. And so she entered the colonial record because her death lay within colonial jurisdiction. But it's important to recognise that a whole lot of other elements around this event, particularly the illicit love affair, which led to the attempted abortion and so on, lay within a domain that British colonial authorities declined to intervene in or to attempt to restructure or reorder. And here, this was a case within what you could term the government of sexuality. And it was her illicit love affair, which was then taken to a village caste panchayat, and it was dealt with there. And there are whole series of rules and crimes which could be established, and penalties and so on. And so these have legacies today, as well as the kind of the colonial overhang that you might call it. So this is one aspect of colonial penal power. Another was what they referred to as ordinary crimes, which they regarded as unexceptional. So Chandra's death, though it was a serious crime, was regarded as essentially an ordinary crime because it was not exceptional. And I'll say in a moment what exceptional crimes were understood as. But within this, once things entered the colonial penal sphere, one aspect of that is that the prison was not central to it. And so when we're talking about colonial penal history on the subcontinent, as I think in many places elsewhere, while we can see, and you can see on your right here, an extract from the Indian Jails Committee report from 1919-1920, it looks very much like probably one of the British jail reports of around that era. While there were prisons, they weren't central, they weren't used a lot, and there was a strong emphasis on adapting English principles to fit the local conditions, such as the caste sensitivities in relation to the holding different types of prisoners together. So this is, I suppose, one aspect of this field. But another important aspect is what were called or understood as exceptional crimes. And there's a whole series of these, of which particularly crimes against government, sedition, terrorism, all these sorts of things, which are very important, which often attracted quite strong responses, particularly crimes against British subjects there. And for example, Dina Heath at Liverpool has written an excellent book called Colonial Terror, which I would recommend to you. So that's something which I have to bracket off here today. But another type of crime which was regarded as exceptional was crimes which were viewed as corporate in character or professional in character. And so one of those forms was the criminality of tribes. And this was a moment when the idea of caste was developing through the 1850s and 1860s. And caste was being equated with profession, and it was understood as a kind of a hereditary category. And thus, if you could find, as colonial administrators did find tribes who were engaged in criminality, it was imagined that they were essentially hereditary criminal classes, and they were legislated against in 1871 through a Criminal Tribes Act. We can see on the right here the development of handbooks, manuals, and so on, of a increasingly expansive architecture of control that lay outside the established penal system. So it didn't fall under the Indian Penal Code or the Code of Criminal Procedure or anything like this, but instead worked to regulate, manage, and often sedentarize particular tribes who were thought to be, as the section 2 of the legislation says, addicted to the systematic commission of non-bailable offences. It was expensive. The party tribe, who I will be talking about today, were one of what was estimated to be about 4 million in 1947, with other estimates running as high as 11 million. People who were captured within this network of control, which involved placing people in camps, running passport systems, taking children from their parents, a whole set of sentence magnifications. So if you were sentenced for a particular offence, such as burglary, it could be doubled or tripled, or people could be transported for life to one of the penal colonies, and so on. So what happened at independence? Well, in some ways, this whole architecture was pulled down. We had the Constitution of India, this idea that there would be justice for all, liberty for all, equality, the dignity of the individual, and so on and so forth. But at the same time this was being produced, there was running, as you can see in the left-hand image here, a Criminal Tribes Act Inquiry Committee, and that committee decided, and it reflected widespread views, that the idea of criminals by birth was an outdated concept and something would need to be done. But at the same time, the new provincial governments were reluctant to extend these notional liberties that ought to have been accorded to all citizens under the Constitution, to those who had formerly been notified as members of criminal tribes. So instead, what we find is that while the old governing act, the Government of India Act 1935, talked about European vagrancy and criminal tribes, we now find in the Constitution vagrancy and nomadic and migratory tribes. And so in some ways, the architecture, the colonial architecture, was pulled apart, and then it was re-established again. And so part of our question in this most recent piece of research that we've been doing was, okay, well, what have been the long-term impacts of that? What does the penal field look like in India? What have been the legacies, and what is the status of these communities that were once penalised under the Criminal Tribes Act, then denotified as criminal tribes, and then carved out from the protections of the Constitution because they were listed as one of these scheduled special cases, these either vagrants or nomadic or migratory tribes. And that's where we find ourselves with this piece of research, and you can see with the image on the right, many of these nomadic communities remain nomadic. The parties who were once nomadic hunters through Maharashtra have been urbanised, almost wholly in Mumbai, but they remain nomadic. And as you can see, they remain as they were in the 19th century, amongst the very poorest and most marginalised in the modern society, just as they were amongst the poorest, most marginalised in the colonial era. Much could be said about the Kiria Saba, but I know time is moving on, so I will. So I've set them aside for today. So if we look at this group who were criminalised in the colonial era, kind of decriminalised, but then carved out from the ordinary protections that given to most citizens, how do we find them today? You can see on the right as an example of one of the locations that we find them in. So I just want to speak to 4 dimensions in which the modern architecture of control works in ways that intersect with what you might call the traditional or mainstream penal field, but which are not wholly penal, even if they are wholly controlling and oppressive. So the first, and I'll go through them very quickly, first relates to mobilities. So the parties remain nomadic within the urban environment of Mumbai because they are subject to oppression by the police, who regard them as essentially unreconstructed criminals. And so what I've referred to here as the precarities of places of rest is that if parties come together, they will tend to be raided by police, and that brings with it all sorts of risks, which include the destruction of their homes and that kind of thing, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what we find is that the parties are in a kind of constant circulation through Mumbai as they attempt to manage the risks posed to them by police working under the brackets misapprehensions of the colonial era, and I'll come to some of that later on as well. Second, the spaces they occupy are contested. Their informality is contested. While their movement is contested, their presence is also contested. And so when a municipal corporation team comes to break up that community that you might, that you can imagine living under that flyover, any attempt to defend their property and their persons is met with the possibility of criminal charges being laid under the Indian Penal Code for deterring a public servant in discharge of their duty. So here we see the kind of the intersection between the civil and the criminal as municipal authorities rest upon the power of the Indian Penal Code to go in and clean this community out of contested spaces, such as under the flyover where that group were living. Thirdly, there's the question of who these people are. And so I've referred to this as enumeration and legal identity. To be counted is to be a citizen. How do we become a citizen? Well, for most of us, it's rather obvious. Our birth is counted. And from that moment of birth, we have legal identity. But if you can imagine groups of urban nomads at the very margins of society, such as these parties are, circulating through Mumbai, they lack many of the basic elements for establishing legal identity and thus being counted, and indeed of claiming the entitlements of citizenship. So they are amongst the very poorest in the land, yet they cannot access ration cards because they have no identity. They cannot register the births of their children because the parents of the children have no identity. One of the key forms of legal identity in India is a certificate of passing schooling. Those who are circulating, ducking the police, trying to find work and so on, are unable to school their children in ordinary ways. Anyone attempting to report a crime, of course, must be able to say who they are, and without that legal identity, they're unable to report crimes, and so on and so forth. And so a whole sort of architecture of control comes to criminalise their lifeways. So many of their traditional means of earning living, such as performance, are criminalised under begging legislation. And that begging legislation comes and intersects with other forms of legislation, which I'll show you right now. So we have here two acts, the Bombay Prevention of Begging Act 1959 and the Juvenile Justice, Care and Protection of Children Act 2015. So, and these become key pieces of legislation in the penalisation, I suppose, of the party community. So when we surveyed them, almost 70% were completely homeless, living on those pavements, under flyovers, on beaches, in small tent camps, on the side of the road, and these sorts of things. 14% were living in informal settlements, i.e. slums. So this is a community at the very edge of society. As they attempt to earn livings through their traditional forms of street performance and so on, they become caught up in the risks of being arrested for begging. If they are arrested for begging, that will affect their capacity to be recognised as what you might call viable parents, and their children may be withdrawn from them and placed under state care under the Juvenile Justice Act. Without any documentation, it's difficult for them to enrol the children in school because the children have no legal identity themselves. And they come to find that, in fact, the only legal identity they can actually claim is that of a homeless person. And so their identity and personhood comes to be reshaped by homelessness as a key sense of self and of who they are. And thus, behind all of this are sub-penal or quasi-penal institutional controls. And you can see here at the bottom point on the slide that a second offence for begging can bring 10 years incarceration in a beggar's home. And recalcitrant beggars in a beggar's home can be transferred into a prison. So we see these different ways in which the control is exerted, and the threat of being charged is one of the main ways in which they are extorted by police. So what's novel about all of this? Well, I think it's important to say that this case is only one form of penal assemblage. But it is a particularly, I think, important and large-scale one. You can see from the data and the table on the right, the graph on the right, that imprisonment is not central to penal control in India. So their rate is 34 per 100,000 of population. The lowest we have on there, and the figure on the right, is Haiti with about 100. So the prison use is exceptionally low. in India, but that does not mean that individuals are not penalised. And so we've tried to think about penality in this Indian case study as something which works through space, and that the way in which individuals' lives are gridded and latticed by various forms of control that position and hold these individuals and communities in a certain place within society, and that restricts their mobilities. So it restricts their vertical social mobilities, their capacity to improve themselves, to move up the social, however you would like to term it. And it also restricts their horizontal freedoms of providing for their children adequately and so on. And all of this connects with, if we go back to the case of Chandra's death, long-standing Indigenous views within the society about these tribes and these types of people, and norms of how they may be dealt with, caste norms about who can come close to them, who may not, and so on. And so here we have on the top right image here a tweet from a woman named Kiran Bedi, who is a very famous Indian woman. Wikipedia describes her as a social activist. She's one of India's most well-known police officers. She did a lot of quote-unquote good work in restructuring one of India's biggest prisons, Tihar Jail. And yet here she is saying ex-criminal tribes are known to be very cruel. They are hardcore professionals in committing crimes, rarely caught or convicted. And so here we have the colonial mindset enduring into the present day. That, along with a whole lot of other forms which I don't have time to talk about today, are the ways in which social norms, social attitudes, memories of these tribes, the fact they are still called denotified criminal tribes, almost reattests to their criminality. But I suppose thinking about penality, it made us wonder whether in our Western, Northern, mainstream European, Euro-American, Australasian discussions of penality, whether we are really talking about penality or whether we are using penality and carcerality as synonymous or readily exchangeable terms. And so we looked back at this idea of penality and the origins of the term. And if you look back to the Middle French of it, to the Latin and to the Middle French, we have something which looks much closer to what the criminal tribes experience. Sometimes punishment, but more often pain, sorrow, suffering, and forms of confinement which are not the defining feature of their lives and which are not always penal, such as being kept in a beggar home or a child placed under the Juvenile Justice Act into a care home, but can quickly intersect with penal institutions. And this is an issue which affects a lot of people. There are estimated, more than a decade ago, to be 150 million denotified criminal tribes. And the discriminations they suffer, even from leading social activists such as Kiran Bedi, are deep-rooted discriminations which are drawn from the colonial period, but not necessarily entirely from the architecture of British colonial control. So, in conclusion, what can we take from this case? I think that in terms of legacies, these contemporary penal forms in India, they do reflect enduring colonial legacies, but they are colonial legacies that have also taken root in post-colonial India, and they bear distinctly post-colonial characteristics. So the use of the exceptional legislation, such as the Criminal Tribes Act, has indeed been dispensed with. But these social groupings, the denotified criminal tribes and the nomadic tribes, this huge population, they remain essentially positioned and controlled in much the same way as that colonial architecture sought to achieve. Another conclusion is that the prison is peripheral, but forms of confinement which can intersect with the prison and can lead to imprisonment are at least potentially part of their life. And that there are these intersecting controls that restrict their access to citizenship rights, which come right from the actual heart of the Constitution itself, which begins to make carve-outs in the liberty rights that citizens should enjoy. And after 70 years after the passage of the Constitution, we find very slow and incremental change, but an attempt to do so under a focus which is very much increasingly human rights focused. In terms of theoretical conclusions, and this is the last thing that I'll say because I know I'm running through time. Well, first and obviously, there's no one South to speak of. So we have talked about southern penal spaces, but we use that as a way of opening up for discussion and thought what we are seeing here and asking the question whether we can be thinking about penalities of the South in much more spatialized terms and much less institutionalized terms than perhaps characterizes northern accounts of penalty. So what we see is in these spaces a real, and we use these terms, latticing and gridding of these spaces with controls that are generally civil in character. And we haven't talked about all of them either in the paper or in this presentation, but there are other controls around animal welfare legislation, because these are communities that have typically had animals for display, for circuses and all these sorts of things, which is another sort of example of civil controls. And we wonder whether this more expansive view of penality, of an older understanding of penalty, which is less carceral, more understanding the pains and the sorrows and the suffering of people who are captured within these forms of control and restriction. And I suppose the last word that I'd say before I flick on to the end slide, which bookmarks with the first, is that these controls and restrictions reach deep into the ontological character and personhood of these tribes. The parties, there are experience attempts to disintegrate them as a type or a category of people. And that is a major way in which this in which these forms of pain and sorrow and suffering are experienced. So with that, I just leave you again with this image of this Padi mother in their camp under the flyover in Mumbai. So thank you very much, and I would welcome thoughts, reflections, questions, and so on.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating. Even in